Happy Thanksgiving, Calvary family. I wanted to bring you a Thanksgiving message today, just a short word about history and about how we can be thankful even during the middle of a tough situation, of a tough year. And to do that, I wanted to talk about the very first pilgrims and the very first Thanksgiving. This year commemorates the 400th anniversary of the pilgrims arriving in North America. They traveled across the ocean in the year 1620. But before we kind of get too much further, and I want to just take you back even a few years before then, King James was the King of England, the King James Bible guy. And there was a group of people that saw that the Church of England, that the king was in charge of the church and the state in that time, and they realized that the church was corrupt, and worse yet, it taught false or unscriptural doctrines. These people separated themselves from the Church of England and hence became known as separatists. But as the King of England, King James, saw that these separatists not only were kind of rebellious against his rule, but he thought that they were a threat to national security, so he kicked them out of the country. They ended up spending several years in Holland, but then they decided, those years didn't go so well actually, then they decided to take a big risk and go to North America, go to the New World, what is now the United States. As I mentioned, the year was 1620. These separatists later became known as pilgrims, and they got on the Mayflower to voyage to the New World. The voyage itself was difficult. There was no first-class accommodations in those old wooden ships, and it took 66 days to cross the Atlantic, and they arrived in late fall, and they ended up too far north, and so it wasn't until December until they found their place to land and to start building their colony, and it was the middle of January before they first got their first house built. Most of the passengers had to spend much of the winter on the Mayflower. And the winters in Massachusetts, where they landed, are a little warmer than Minnesota, but not so much. If you think of Minnesota in November or maybe March, that's about what they had to deal with for their winter. Some of us would be excited by the challenge of maybe wintering outside or having a camping excursion outside, but if you imagine bringing your family and not having any supplies or any permanent structures to go home to, they had a lot to deal with as they arrived in the New World. Many of the pilgrims died that first winter from diseases, from a lack of good food, from the elements. During the worst of the sickness, only 6 or 7 pilgrims were able to care for the other ones who were sick and dying. The cool part of the history is that in the spring, they were visited by not one, but 2 Native Americans who spoke English. Yeah. The most famous of them you probably heard of, his name was Squanto. He taught the pilgrims who were weakened by malnutrition and illness, he taught them how to cultivate corn and extract sap from maple trees and catch fish in the rivers, and which plants were good to eat and which ones weren't. And then in the year 1621, Governor William Bradford declared that they would have a celebration, that they would be thankful for all that they had. We know from history that there was some kind of bird, probably turkey, but probably other birds as well, ducks and geese and so on. Venison was on the menu. Local vegetables that likely appeared on that first table included onions and beans and lettuce and spinach and cabbage, probably carrots and maybe peas. Corn was plentiful, but most often corn was served by mashing the hard kernels into kind of a porridge type situation. Most of the fruits around that region include things like blueberries and plums and grapes and gooseberries and raspberries and, of course, cranberries. But there wasn't any sugar to make cranberry sauce, so they probably had to eat them another way. And with no sugar and no real oven, there almost certainly was not pie either, for those of you who are big pie fans. Most of the food was probably more closely associated with the way Native Americans would cook their food than the way the Europeans would. But they made it, and they had a lot to be thankful for. But that's really a matter of perspective, isn't it? It's said that every single family represented on the Mayflower lost at least one person during that first year. Only 53 out of the 102 who arrived at Plymouth Colony were around to celebrate that first Thanksgiving. So here was this group of poor people, didn't have any money, they faced religious persecution, they had a horrible winter, they had sickness, they had disease, so many deaths, and yet they were thankful to God for everything they did have. And that's a great reminder for us this year as we think about everything we have. As we close, I'd like to share these verses with you. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." And Psalm 107 verse 1 says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his love endures forever." And we're thankful for that as well. Thanks. Have a good Thanksgiving.